but to perpetuate relatively unchanged what they gave us? Or do we best honor them by engaging in reflection and choice, asking what the lessons of experience are, and then acting accordingly? And I'm not suggesting, I really am not suggesting, that acting accordingly means to take up arms and run a new version of the American Revolution. I am saying that acting accordingly is to engage in serious reflection and choice, to connect the dots between our discontents and the political system, the inefficacious, even the sometimes imbecilic political system that, however well motivated, they gave us in 1787. And for me, there is no more important question that one could possibly ask on Constitution Day. As usual, I've spoken longer than I should have, but fortunately, there is time, we've got about 20 minutes, for questions and statements. Feel free to say things in declarative sentences if you wish. This ought to be a conversation and not a news conference. Yeah.
So you talked about back right before the Civil War how polarized the country was, and then we went through such an event as the Civil War and came out, and how it didn't end till 71 after KKK had been established and all that. Do you think that after an election like is coming up now, we would be due for such drastic events?
I think that's an extraordinarily important and depressing question. The governor of Kentucky gave a speech earlier this week in which he seemed to suggest that the election of Hillary Clinton would legitimately provoke such an outrage that it might take the form of violence. Those thoughts are in the air. After Barack Obama's re-election with a majority of the vote in 2012, lots and lots of people across the country, a very small minority, I mean the country is 320 million people, but lots and lots of people in terms of raw numbers, signed petitions ostensibly in support of secession. The largest number, 125,000, come from the state in which I've lived for 36 years, that is Texas. Now, Texas is 26 million people, so as a political matter, you can say 125,000 is insignificant. There may be 125,000 people who believe that the earth is flat. But what I don't know is whether the result of this election will make secessionism more of a legitimate idea. I mean, and William has mentioned that I write quite often on a blog site called Balkanization. I have speculated, assuming Donald Trump wins, why should Pacifica, that is California, Oregon, Washington, or New England, that is New England plus New York, and maybe New England down to Maryland, why do they necessarily want to stay in the Union? You know, there's Abraham Lincoln, the mystic chords of memory. There's what political scientists call path dependence. We're in the Union. But I can certainly imagine, you know, dinner table conversation in which people living in Pacifica would say, let's get out. California, I think it's usually described as the 11th strongest economy in the world. I suspect these days it might even be better than that. California doesn't need the United States in order to maintain itself. So why should it stay? But you can imagine similar conversations taking place in Dixie, in Texas. Why do you want to stay around if this crook becomes president, especially if she gets to appoint to pack the next Supreme Court given the Democratic Senate? And the first thing the Democratic Senate ought to do is to eliminate the filibuster with regard to Supreme Court nominees. So she'll pack the Supreme Court with liberals. Why should we stay around? Why should Texas, with its 26 million people, I don't know exactly what the figures are for the Texas economy, but we could clearly make at least as good a go of it as Slovenia, Fiji, and dozens of other countries who are in the UN. So I think your question is a very serious question. That right now secessionism is crazy within the United States. But if you look around the world, secession is not crazy. Brexit surprised an awful lot of people. Up until literally the day of the vote, most thoughtful people said, well, this will be a useful safety valve, but surely a majority of the Brits won't be so crazy as to wreck the European Union and run the risk of dissolving the United Kingdom itself, which will almost certainly happen if Brexit goes through, because Scotland will undo the Treaty of Union of 1707, older even than the United States, and say we want to be independent. So, you look at Catalonia, you look at places all around the world, American exceptionalism cuts both ways. We are founded in secession, that is secession from the British Empire in 1776. We killed 750,000 people in 1861, 1865 over the legitimacy of secession. And so why do we think that it can never happen again? I would be truly shocked if a civil war were to happen again. I think most of the country would probably be thrilled to let Texas go. But again, to take your question fully seriously, because it is a fully serious question, will there be serious people and not merely political crazies who will start questioning the value of the union? I don't know what the answer to that question is, but it's an incredibly important question. Yeah.
Well, first I'd like to thank you, Dr. Levinson, for coming and speaking to UMBC as a whole and for this semester. But my question more has to go on your hypothetical constitutional convention that's going on. I was wondering, since there is such the disapproval with Congress, as you were talking about before, how would the delegations work in this hypothetical?
Another good, frequently asked question. On the principle that if you're going to hang for a lamb, you may as well hang for the sheep, and maybe stealing the whole flock. My answer to that question is that you pick the delegates at random with very, very limited constraints. That is, there clearly have to be age constraints. You don't want a 6-year-old at a constitutional convention. You want to have a sufficiently stratified sample that you don't have everybody from California or the Rockies or wherever, because statistically, if you deal bridge hands at random, every now and then you're going to deal a hand with 13 diamonds. And so you want to safeguard against that possibility. So you say there has to be some degree of geographical representation. But by and large, that would be it. It would be a nationwide citizen jury with enough time and money to hold whatever hearings they want within the United States and all over the world, to call in whatever experts they want to hear. But frankly, a lot of this isn't rocket science. It's not that I'm asking you to design a spaceship that can get from here to Mars without killing whoever the astronauts might be. Rather, it's thinking about very basic issues of governance. Are we well served by the presidential veto in its present form, where over history, presidents win 95% of all veto battles because it's so hard to override a veto? But this assumes keeping the presidential system. We can have an argument right now. You don't need to be a capital E expert in order to say, well, is this too much power being placed in the hand of the president? Or do you feel reassured? And you can hear experts, you can hear people, but you don't have to do your own decision on this. But that's the way I would get around the problem of delegates. Elected delegates would be a nightmare, frankly. In the system we live in, it would be an invitation to every well-financed single-issue group to try to capture the convention. Random selection would assure that there will be some people you regard as crazies at the convention, but that's fine. If there are, let's say, 700 delegates, we're a big country, there are going to be some people who you think are crazy. So what? Give them the chance to make their pitch, because some people are going to think your views are crazy, but you're not going to control the convention. The other way to get delegates, of course, is to have them appointed. Then the question, who does the appointment? It can't be Congress. State legislatures raise independent problems. So I go the random selection. But all of this requires that you not find the idea of convention just crazy in the first place. I think all the way in the back, you had your hand up. Yeah.
Hi. Yes, I listened, but I didn't see any discussion of the interplay and the changes in the Supreme Court since the Constitution and how that relates to the whole ballgame.
Yeah, let me say,
Because in the original Constitution, there wasn't, it didn't seem like there was a idea that the court would invalidate legislation.
well, there are two things going on. First of all, did the framers contemplate judicial review? It's a tough question, but I think the answer ultimately is yes. You can find some people who assumed that a court would invalidate legislation because there were some state courts doing that. But then there are two other questions that follow. First of all, what would it take to invalidate legislation? And so what was sometimes expressed was what's come to be called the clear mistake rule. That is, if Congress were to pass legislation that were clearly and unequivocally unconstitutional. Easiest example. The Constitution says you need 2 witnesses for treason. What if Congress passed a law saying, 2 witnesses make it too hard to convict people? So let's say 1 will be enough. That's unconstitutional, period. Just as it would, alas, be unconstitutional if Congress said, it's really stupid to wait until January 20th to inaugurate a new president, which I think it is. What we need to do is to move Inauguration Day up to December 15th, which would make much more sense, which I think is the case. It would be unconstitutional because the 20th Amendment, one of my favorite amendments, says January 20th. The problem is that Congress has never passed such completely mistaken legislation. So the debate about judicial review turns into a debate about how much latitude you want to give the Supreme Court as against Congress or state legislatures. That would be the topic for the lecture. But there's one final point. I think we overestimate tremendously the importance of the judiciary. There are some people who are giving as their one reason for supporting Donald Trump how awful Hillary Clinton's appointments would be. No doubt there are some people who give as their one reason for supporting Hillary Clinton how awful Donald Trump's appointments might be. You know, I have my own views as to who ought to be on the Supreme Court, and I don't think that the Supreme Court is unimportant. But in terms of what leads most Americans to be pessimistic about the future, the country's going the wrong direction. In terms of what leads most Americans to having contempt for Congress, it has nothing to do with the Supreme Court. It is that you have a set of issues you think are crucially important. As I think, depending on where you are on the political spectrum, there are likely to be somewhat different issues. But what will unite us is that you have no confidence that the present national government will react effectively to respond to whatever you think the most important issues are. If you look, and here I go back to polls. If you look at polls asking Americans, what do you think are the most important problems facing this country? Very rarely are they going to name anything that the Supreme Court is considering. There are a